Good evening, everyone. My name is Nell Pepper, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am delighted to introduce this virtual event with Rebecca Solnit, presenting her memoir, Recollections of My Nonexistence, in conversation with Chanel Miller. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you so much for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and to our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week, we host events here on our Zoom account, and just like always, our event schedule appears on our website at harvard.com, and you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button on your screen and we will get through as many questions as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase copies of Recollections of My Nonexistence on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of the series and of our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore in Harvard Square. We thank you so much for showing up and providing your support by tuning in, both in support of our authors and of the truly fantastic staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And lastly, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings this past year, technical issues may arise. If they do, we hope they don't, but if they do, we will do our best to resolve them quickly. We thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now I am honored to introduce our speakers. Rebecca Solnit is the author of more than 20 books, including A Field Guide to Getting Lost, The Faraway Nearby, A Paradise Built in Hell, River of Shadows, and Wanderlust, A History of Walking. She is also the author of Men Explain Things to Me, as well as many essays on feminism, activism, and social change, hope, and the climate crisis. Chanel Miller is a writer and artist. Her memoir, Know My Name, was a New York Times bestseller, a New York Times Book Review notable book, and a winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award. It was named a Best Book of the Year in the Washington Post, Time, Chicago Tribune, and NPR, among others. She was named one of the Forbes 30 Under 30 and a Time Next 100 honoree, and was a Glamour Woman of the Year honoree under her pseudonym Emily Doe. Tonight, they'll be discussing Rebecca Solnit's latest book, her memoir, Recollections of My Nonexistence. Beyond being a memoir, the book's account of Solnit's coming of age in 1980 San Francisco illuminates the menace and the contradictory, crazy-making strictures that are familiar to women everywhere. Maris Kreisman praises, Recollections of My Nonexistence is a marvel, a memoir that details Solnit's awakening as a feminist, an environmentalist, and a citizen of the world. Every single sentence is exquisite. I'm so pleased to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Rebecca and Chanel.
Well, good evening, everyone. And Chanel, you're the boss on this, so I'm so happy to see you and so excited that your book is the One City, One book for my town, San Francisco, except for the part that you're not coming out for it because we're having a pandemic.
I'll be right here.
Okay.
So happy to be with you, Rebecca. I would love to have you read the intro to your beautiful book. And for the audience, we'll be doing like a 40-minute conversation and then 20 minutes for questions. So please be sure to be sending in your questions as we go along. So Rebecca, take it away.
Thank you. One day long ago, I looked at myself as I faced a full-length mirror and saw my image darken and soften, and then seem to retreat as though I was vanishing from the world, rather than that my mind was shutting it out. I steadied myself on the doorframe just across the hall from the mirror, and then my legs crumpled under me. My own image drifted away from me into darkness, as though I was only a ghost, fading even from my own sight. I blacked out occasionally and had dizzy spells often in those days. But this time was memorable because it appeared as though it wasn't that the world was vanishing from my consciousness, but that I was vanishing from the world. I was the person who was vanishing and the disembodied person watching her from a distance, both and neither. In those days, I was trying to disappear and to appear, trying to be safe and to be someone, and those agendas were often at odds with each other. And I was watching myself to see if I could read in the mirror what I could be and whether I was good enough and whether all the things I'd been told about myself were true. To be a young woman is to face your own annihilation in innumerable ways, or to flee it or the knowledge of it, or all these things at once. The death of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world, said Edgar Allan Poe, who must not have imagined it from the perspective of women who prefer to live. I was trying to not be the subject of someone else's poetry and not to get killed. I was trying to find a poetics of my own, with no maps, no guides, not much to go on. They might have been out there, but I hadn't located them yet. The struggle to find a poetry in which your survival rather than your defeat is celebrated, perhaps to find your own voice to insist upon that, or at least to find a way to survive amid an ethos that relishes your erasures and failures, is work that many and perhaps most young women have to do. In those early years, I did not do it particularly well or clearly, but I did it ferociously. And then I'm just going to add one little paragraph that really contextualizes what this book is and isn't. Memoirs at their most conventional are stories of overcoming, arcs of eventual triumph, personal problems to be taken care of by personal evolution and resolve. That a lot of men wanted and still want to harm women, especially young women, that a lot of people relish that harm and a lot more dismissed it, impacted me in profoundly personal ways, but the cure for it wasn't personal. There was no adjustment I could make in my psyche or my life that would make this problem acceptable or non-existent, and there was nowhere to go to leave it behind.
Oh, it's so flipping good. I
Thank you.
double underlined, and even I dog ear important pages, and then I hot dog style fold the most important pages. So I have a
Is
lot
that
of
the double, what's hot dog style? Is that the double fold?
notes, like I fold the paper in half.
Oh, I see. Okay, okay.
It's very important.
Book management techniques.
I just want to say, Rebecca, your writing has been so nourishing and encouraging for many years. For those who don't know, I've seen Rebecca speak 4 times in San Francisco, and I was anonymous each time. I attended a book signing. As soon as I got to the table, I started weeping. She didn't know who I was. She stood up, came around, held me, said, "I hope we cross paths again." We have crossed paths many times since. And for me personally, like, I feel like we have all these moments in our lives, our own little galleries. And when I was writing my memoir, I had to revisit my own little lifetime of galleries. And so many of the little captions I had written that I thought I knew, I found myself revising after I had encountered your work and scribbling out just the ways that I saw those moments and really assigning them new meaning. And so I want to thank you for the lens of respect and patience and gravity that you give to us to see our own lives. I want to start this talk by talking about your 19-year-old self, who we meet in chapter 1. She's sitting on this bus riding this line through San Francisco, and she arrives at her first apartment and opens the door to this sun-filled room. And this 19-year-old self and the room she occupies are 2 characters, 2 very powerful pieces who merge, and sort of this scene becomes the base of where you begin to build yourself. And I'm interested because you've written over 20 books now, and I imagine that every time that you sit down to write, your 19-year-old self has been living in you somewhere. And I was wondering, has she been in the wings, sort of waiting to come out, and you say, hold on, you'll get your turn eventually? Has she been dormant? I just think you've carried this young self in the room, this whole time. And so why did it feel important to summon her and deliver this scene to us now?
As a feminist, I keep hoping that somehow what I write becomes obsolete and undone because violence against women is no longer an issue. And I know that I will be doing this for the rest of my life anyway.
Yeah.
But I have written a lot about violence against women, starting with my first piece in Maximum Rock and Roll, the punk rock magazine in 1985, when I won't do the math, 23 or 24. And, and I realized at a certain point, not that long ago, almost everything I'd done, except maybe a passage in Wanderlust, which came out in 2000, where I talked about the lack of freedom women have because of this, exactly what British women are talking about in the aftermath of the murder of Sarah Everard, that I'd written a lot about highly public cases, Weinstein and Cosby, the Isla Vista massacre, that I know is very connected to you because you were there, connected to me because I'm friends with the father and uncle of one of the victims, Alan and Richard Martinez. But I'd written about the politics and the meaning and the existential dimensions and the legal and all this stuff. And I felt like I'd never adequately conveyed, what does it do to us to live in a world where not only a lot of men want to harm us, possibly unto death, and the whole culture essentially celebrates that in art and music and film and literature, and trivializes it and pretends it doesn't really happen when it happens, or blames the victim. And what does it mean to live in a society that wants to destroy you, essentially, and that will not acknowledge that the impact of living in this, under this, with a sort of sword of Damocles hanging over you. And I had such an intense experience of that, really at that point at 19. And I grew up in a violent family, thought somehow all I had to do was leave and then I'd be safe. And I've never been unsafe, almost never been unsafe at home ever since. So the discovery that, okay, I had this beautiful apartment given to me by Mr. Young, the building manager of this building, and but the world outside was potentially lethal. And I'd kind of known it because growing up as, girls are, as my friend Heather said to me late in the writing of this book, and I had to kind of shoehorn it in, we're always invited to imagine our own murder. And that's something the British women are talking about now. Don't wear this, don't go there, don't drink that, don't talk to these people, watch this, carry a whistle, carry your car keys, check your car, don't park at the far end of the lot, don't travel, don't have adventures, don't, essentially cease to live, that you may, so that somebody doesn't, terminate your life, and the responsibility is on you. And so it was real. So I really wanted to convey what it was like to really fully encounter that intense menace in a world that had not yet had any adequate conversations about it outside of the feminist circles I had not yet joined. And the public conversation, I think, that really began in 2012 or 13, has not solved the problem, but it's changed the dimensions in a lot of ways, as have things like Title IX and the affirmative consent laws in California and New York on campus, and a lot of other things, which is not to say that it's all great now, but I just wanted to convey both what it was like subjectively, even as somebody to whom the worst things didn't happen, though they happened to people all around me, but also how inseparable this was from the larger questions of what it means to be a woman. The violence against women is always violence against our voices, the voice with which you have self-determination to say yes or no to what other people do to and with you, the voice with which you say this happened to me, which is discounted and, or you're menaced or harassed or shamed for speaking up. And so and my experience as a woman was very ordinary. I lived under threat. My voice was constantly being, it wasn't even being erased. I'd been so acculturated acculturated to expect that things would only get worse if I spoke up, people wouldn't care, they'd blame me, etc. That there was so many situations I just didn't even speak in. And so I had this profound voicelessness at the same time that I had, since I'd learned how to read, intended to be a writer. And now I was trying in earnest, more so when I entered my 20s. And to be a writer is to decide that you are going to have a voice you think other people should listen to professionalize it, to develop it as a skill and technique, to find out who you really are and what you have to say. And those two things collided in so many ways, in practical ways, with some of the really shitty men in the publishing industry, in sometimes my own sense of my, capacity to speak. I Didn't Men Explain Things, the essay I wrote in 2008, which we're thinking of throwing a bat mitzvah for in April when it will turn 13. I talk about really being about 40 when I finally arrived at, because I was the author of several books of history, enough confidence in myself that when men told me the thing they had just done hadn't really happened and I was subjective and delusional and unreliable, it was only then that I actually had the confidence within myself to know, not, to trust my own capacity to bear witness and to tell them so, and to not put up with that anymore. And the shock of that, of course, is it means that for 39 years I had been, like so many women, somebody who could be gaslighted and badgered and harassed out of stating what had just happened, and which is a privilege men assume. That became kind of a national political phenomenon when Donald Trump and the Republican Party began gaslighting, the nation, as women are gaslighted by men so often. So I wanted to convey what it means to have try and make a voice, and what it means not to have a voice, and those two things together. And in writing it, I came to understand finally kind of the Solnit theory of voice, that all of this violence is against voices. And that and this is so much what your book is about, that this terrible thing, a man does this terrible thing to you, and then you have to find the voice, and the horrible thing your sexual assault victims go through. You can't be too emotional, you can't be too cruel and dispassionate, you have to perform while huge forces are trying to convince you not to do it. You're punished for doing it, you'll be punished for not doing it. So this question of, of voices, of how much it's always been about not having the voice to say no, not having the voice that will be believed, not having the voice, even if you're believed, that will have consequences, not having, because voices are so inseparable from the rest of our dignity, our humanity, our membership in society, our self-determination, our power. And we think of voice, we talk sometimes as though voice is just the capacity to make a noise, and it's so much more. It's the capacity to make contracts and set boundaries, bear witness, make commitments, and that gets taken away from people all the time, and not just women, to people of color who can't testify, who don't have, are not allowed to have the credibility to testify against the police, and undocumented people who have to speak through translators. And there's so, and the voiceless in some ways outnumbers the voiced. And so much of the work, I think, for all of us in this country and everywhere, is to make a democracy of voices. I think that's the goal of feminism and all the human rights work I've ever connected to.
Yeah, absolutely. So much to respond to, but I love how you talk about just the constant threat of violence. Like, even you said in your book, it gets you even if it doesn't get you, right? And there's a cost to living under that constant threat, and there's not enough attention paid to the almost happening, right? Because almost happenings make the headlines, but all of us collectively live in the almost happening. And you talk about refraining being a form of safety. I wrote down all the adjectives you said: hemmed in, hunted, We are experts at fading, slipping, sneaking, squirming, dodging, disengaging, absenting ourselves. Just literally every adjective and verb synonymous with disappearing, we have mastered. And you mentioned the case of Sarah Everard, the woman in the UK who was just murdered, and women being advised not to go at night. So it's almost like when a woman is hurt, all of us are punished. All of us go back to that refrain in order to establish safety. But there's never a public announcement that says, men, your nighttime privileges have been revoked. You must not exit after sundown so that women can go get their groceries and run freely until you can behave. That's never, it's always us doing the work. So I do want to ask you, you say in the book, well, what you said about turning 40, what the heck? I think, I hope I've, don't have to wait that long to fully, anyway, you talk about how the choice between being fearless and powerful and being yourself were two lines that you thought would never intersect and that they would run parallel forever. And so I want to hear about your relationship to power now. And I know that for me, it is difficult to summon on my own. Like if you give me a stage and a microphone and set it up, then yes, I possess that power, but I've only had glimpses of power and I've never been able to sustain it. And I'm also aware of the fact that it can easily be revoked. When my statement went viral, I was reminded of the cost of gaining power. I was becoming harassed because suddenly I had too much support, and some people didn't like that. So I want to hear about when in your life you have felt the most powerful, how you define power, and how you possess it now.
What a great question. I think a lot of my early experiences of feeling powerful and also safe were as an activist. And one of the annoying things about this culture is that activism is always treated as though it's your broccoli, eat your broccoli, it's good for you. Oh, you're so virtuous, you ate your broccoli. But I've always found, okay, not in every activist circle. There is the Doing It Wrong Brigade lurking in many movements. But, but in the work I did as an anti-nuclear and environmental activist, and most of all my work with the Western Shoshone Defense Project in the early 1990s, early and mid 1990s, finding these incredible communities. And there's also this way when you may not yet dare to speak on behalf of yourself, you can speak on behalf of a cause, but also as a member of a group. And just the physical, the psychic and physical feeling of marching through the streets, whether it's celebratory, a victory parade, or anti-war protest or something, walking down the middle of the street with 10,000 people who agree with you. The Women's March on January 21st, 2017 here in San Francisco, and actually I forget how many thousand places around the country, so it was really, I think a lot of the power we do have is collective, and it's complex because a writer is profoundly individual, and I find the most powerful voice I have is when I stay home alone and write and speak silently with my fingers. But that was the early experience of not of individual power, but of having joined collective power. And I think in a way, individual power would be really corrosive if it didn't exist in service of something larger. And I think there's also a self-forgetting when you're so passionate about an issue where you're no longer, oh, do I look weird? Am I right? Are they going to question me or something, where you're just, up there speaking, up there standing up. And, so that was a lot of it. And it's also, and there's some ways in which, and I think this happens to a lot of people, particularly people who acquire some power. I have sold a lot of books, and I have some good platforms at The Guardian and formerly at Harper's and stuff like that. And And sometimes it feels odd to think of yourself as a powerful person because I still feel like that 19-year-old in a lot of ways. And sometimes I think you also don't take the responsibility that power and responsibility are inseparable, where, oh, if you do this, you have an impact. Oh, you need to, oh, when you interact with this person, you carry a lot of weight. And so you have to be very tender and careful and aware and things like that. So it often feels like I have to adjust from the subjective feeling of like, I'm just the weird kid who stayed home for ever. Because writing as a kid, I wrote and drew pictures and read books and wandered around in the hills. And now I'm almost 60 and I don't draw pictures. I hang out with people who do. And, and I write and read books and wander around in the hills. And in some ways, writing for a living feels like not growing up. And so it's interesting navigating that, that power and, but also the sense that it's also a great gift, that allows me to, in a way, you become a conduit and a signal amplifier. I can amplify, issues in the climate movement. I can amplify books by people who I think have something to say. I can amplify causes. Occasionally I can fundraise. And, my friend Ana Teresa Fernandez has a climate change project. I'm meeting with her on Monday. She's an incredible visual artist. And, I'm gonna do fundraising for her. So it's interesting and complicated, particularly in a society where people often pretend to be less powerful than they are, and because power is equated to privilege and privilege is equated to being a bad person. And so we often all pretend to be powerless, and most of us have ways in which we are oppressed or not powerful, and also ways in which we are. In my case, in case anybody hadn't noticed, I'm both female and white. And it's one of the things I don't think I did particularly skillfully in this book, but I've been in a non-white city for my whole non-white majority city for my whole adult life. That wonderful apartment Mr. Young gave me was in a very Black neighborhood when I arrived. And I was very cognizant of, here's the ways as a woman I lack some kinds of freedom of movement. Here's the way as a white person I have all this ability to leave the neighborhood and kind of have entree everywhere, fancy department stores, rich neighborhoods, suburbs, etc., that will feel really different for my neighbors. And so I think that's also one of the complex things about, you know, how we navigate these things nowadays, both trying to disavow it and trying to be intersectional and understanding you can both be profoundly empowered and profoundly disempowered.
Right. I want to, you mentioned how, in some ways you still are your 19-year-old self. And there was a line in the book where you enter that first apartment and you say it was more beautiful than anything I'd ever dreamed I could have. That was very striking to me because that's really different than just saying it was objectively beautiful, because what the beauty you were witnessing was unaligned with your perception of self and what you deserved at that time. And you were like in this state of awe of being given something outside the realm of what you thought possible for who you were. So I think a lot of young women are not taught to need or want or demand or claim space or even imagine owning it. We just feel lucky to be included in certain spaces. And I know that after the book was released and I had the opportunity to do some big book events, normally I grew up kind of conditioned to enter rooms and immediately adapt to the energy in that room. Like I'm such a professional at blending in, but at these events, I would walk into the room and feel it shape around me and have people mirror my energy. And it felt really phenomenal. And I'm really glad I got to experience that before the pandemic and sort of see what I can do. And see that that's a possible state of being, to occupy the center of the room and to set the tone. And so my question is, can you talk about that state of evolving from tolerating your environment to beginning to ask more for yourself, and what catalyzed that asking, and how long it took for you to become someone who will who can enter a beautiful sunlit apartment, and instead of feeling surprised, you feel like, of course, of course, this is what I should be given, and I want a fireplace. I just want to hear about just hearing you realize how much you deserved, and how you began to change the way you occupied space.
Oh, that goes in so many directions. And that apartment that I rented when I was 19 and a half, I was so poor. I'd left home at 17, and my parents, who were divorced, were like, great, great, you want to be independent, send a postcard. We're not going to do anything for you, basically. I had like a little money I'd saved and a little money I'd been given that got me through my 17th year. And then I was really, really poor. So I lived in an SRO hotel, a single room occupancy, long-term, residential hotel, which is part of why, and it's funny, I'm sitting in my bedroom, which is bigger than that whole place was, and it's not a big room. And, I couldn't really cook, and, and eating out is expensive. And I could afford $200 a month in 1981 when all this when all this happened. And people laughed at me then when I said I was going to find a $200 a month apartment. And of course, it was in a Black neighborhood that I could find something that was so affordable. And, and I went and looked at this apartment, and it was just, its south and east bay windows, and the light was pouring in, and hardwood floors and high ceilings and molding on the wall and glass paneled doors and crystal doorknobs. It was just luminous. And I went downstairs, and Mr. Young, this wonderful World War II vet, son of Oklahoma sharecroppers, I told him that I really want it. He said, well, if you want it, you should have it. And he handed me the application. It was the same slumlord management company that had already rejected me because I was too poor and was too young to have a rental record. And my face just fell. They had literally looked at my application and dropped it in the wastebasket in front of me, which is sort of like, well, no, you don't get to have nice spaces. You don't get to have anything. And he said, go find some middle-aged woman, some respectable middle-aged lady who will apply, and I'll never tell them no different. And so here was this complete stranger. It's funny because I decided I should start talking about him because nobody has asked me about him. And this is a book in part about the terrible things men do to women and how it impacts us. But there is this one man who gives, in the book, who's kind of, the apartment is a major character. He probably gets more ink than any other human being besides myself in the book. So I got my mom to go out on a limb for me, which she would normally never do. And she was by far the most qualified applicant because she wasn't somebody who actually wanted to live there. And, so she did this one thing for me. I moved in, and then he kind of covered for several years till they figured out I was living there. But it's funny, it was a studio apartment. It was about 400 something square feet, and I stayed for 25 years. And it was kind of, when do I give myself permission to have more than, an apartment with a bed in the closet and, all the limitations of that. And so I'm in a place that's about twice as big, and, and it has a garden and a parking space. So, and as you can all see, some very nice detailing. It's a Victorian apartment that has not been gutted by the techies who are gutting so many beautiful homes in San Francisco, because as a friend said, they all want to live in the Apple store. And but occupying space is, there was this period after mansplaining became a phrase where we started talking about manspreading, the men who sit with their legs way akimbo. And most women have probably been on an airline with some guy whose knees are way into their space and elbows and things. And taking up space. And as women, we're kind of trained not to do it, whether it's about being very small and dainty, which I think, and not being too loud, not eating too much, not asking for too much, not taking up too much room in the conversation, which is a really important thing that I think we can imagine as a physical space. Also in Men Explain Things, I write about being, with two very well-known literary figures. God, 15 years, 15, not quite 20 years ago. And clearly one of them was really irascible. I was actually trying to participate in the conversation. I'm like the young ladies who were supposed to be like a Greek chorus, kind of like, wow, oh, so taking up, and I had that actually as a very young woman where some guy would want me to just be kind of like, oh, you play guitar. Oh, you wrote a poem. And I would be kind of like, oh, that's so great. I'd love to see your poem. And then I'd be like, I wrote something too. And they'd be like, fuck you, bitch. You were not supposed to take up any room as somebody who is anything more than a listener. Obviously not all of them, but, with some of them. So I think there's a lot of questions about taking up space, whether it's the space you live in. And what we're talking about with the constrainedness of female space is being told, don't go out on your own, don't, which for me has been so important as part of exploring and thinking. And as I didn't have the friends to do everything with, and I still don't want to do everything with other people. I want that interiority of wandering alone. And, but a lot of women are told men want to kill you. The solution is for you to not take up space. Don't leave the house, don't live, basically have enough financial resources. You don't need to walk. You don't need to take a taxi or an Uber. You don't need to leave the house. You don't need to work the night shift. You don't, and don't do anything alone, and I think in solitude, we develop ourselves. And so this violence takes away the space to explore it, but also I think the sexual violence says, even your own body is not space you have jurisdiction over. Your body is a space that other people can invade and violate. And so I think for women in a lot of times in places and situations, like literally there is no space that you're given. All of it is taken away. The space to speak, the space inside your body, the space to live, the space to explore, the space to participate. Mm-hmm. So space is one way I think is really useful to conceptualize all this.
Yeah, I think you said a man's property extends beyond him to inside women. It's like goes even beyond the boundaries of our physical selves, and that was really profound. And yes, you do talk a lot about Mr. Young, and I think there's even just one line about how he was subject to testing of gases.
Yeah, poison gases. Yeah, no. Yeah, he told me that. He had been a soldier. He told me they ran all Black troops through rooms filled with poison gas to test their effect, and not all of them made it. And I just remember I was in journalism school at UC Berkeley then, but I was really young. I didn't know how to run. I'm still not an investigative journalist, but now I've been able to pass things off to investigative journalists, sometimes with significant consequences, like around racial violence in post-Katrina New Orleans, but there was nothing I could do with it at the time. And I've researched a little bit online and haven't found accounts. Mm-hmm. But yeah, and so, and it was, yeah. And so, and he'd grown up a sharecropper in the segregated South, and he was very clearly impacted by that. The lovely man I spent my 20s with, who doesn't make much appearance in this book, he actually has a little room in a field guide to getting lost, was from Oklahoma. And I thought like, oh, you're both from Oklahoma. Isn't that great? and it just became clear to me. I was just so young and naive that he thought a white guy from Oklahoma might be prejudiced. And so that it was not a mark. He wasn't, but it was, particularly, but it was not a mark in his favor. And but yeah, no, he was a wonderful guy.
Yeah, I'll slip in one last question before we turn it over to audience questions. But I think of, if you look at my inside, it is like a press room, and my authentic inner voice is just one seat in that press room who still has to raise its hand and fight with all these other voices who are telling me to do things. But it's definitely still not the one who lives at the podium. And so I'm wondering for you, has it been are you closer to your inner voice now? Like, do you get to that authentic voice quicker? Do you have to spend less time clearing away other voices when you sit down to do your writing? I'm just hoping that those voices will start to dim as I get older and more confident.
You mean all those imaginary external people telling you, you can't do this, you should do that, that's not yours, this is how we do it?
Yes, and you said, I was
Those
young
voices.
and not to make a fuss and to let others determine
Yeah.
what's acceptable and even to determine what was real. Like we do know what's real, and yet we spend so much time sifting through other people telling us what's real. So do you feel like you have just lived very intimately and closely with that voice now?
I'm, two things come up for me. One of which is so much of why very young women and girls are supposed to be what's called attractive is that they're vulnerable, and that, they say of us middle-aged women that we have no fucks left to give. And there is just a sense of where it's kind of like, I don't need to placate you. I don't need to deal with you if you're totally self-absorbed. I am not going to let you bully me out of my own. There is a kind of confidence with middle age, which is partly not caring that much what other people think. And I talk about an incident in the book where I had this terrifying bearded white hippie man following me home in the middle of the night, actually in the suburbs, who just seems like one of the mass murder, was probably a serial rapist or murderer, and was gaslighting me in the most extraordinary manipulative way. And when I think back to the person I was at 21 or something, at some level it was actually working on me, where he was trying to convince me he wasn't really following me, nothing unusual was happening, as he's walking like 18 inches behind me on a completely empty street. And of course, if that happened to me at this age, I would not, I would have no doubt about what's going on. I might confront him directly. I would have no qualms about standing in the middle of the street and flagging cars down. This, of course, is decades before cell phones changed some of the options, if you have time to use it, or ringing the doorbell of somebody whose light was on or something like that. So there is that self-doubt. But I think the other way to talk about knowing oneself is, I feel like one of the things that happened the last 4 years that ended on January 20th is, in a way, we all got really shallow. And I felt like I had what I called informational hypervigilance. And like a lot of people felt like I should check the news every 20 minutes. The beginning of the Trump era, journalists were tweeting, half joking, I went out to lunch, what happened? Because like at any time of day or night, something really disruptive that maybe you needed to react to as a citizen or a journalist, but there was this way in which we had to live on what I think of as a kind of superficial level of politics, partly to be good citizens and stand up for undocumented immigrants or trans people or other communities and push back, but partly because it was just so nerve-wracking. It was like being in the room with, a rabid dog. I used to compare Trump to, in South Asia, elephants go into must, male elephants, they go into heat and they become kind of violent and unpredictable and destructive. And you can't, they're elephants, you can't stop them or overpower them, but maybe you can guide them to trample the rice fields and not the children or something. And Trump was like that. Everybody was trying to, and there was like, is he going to use a nuclear weapon? Is he going to, and I feel like we were all so involved in that. It was really hard to be deeper. And it was hard. I read so much news. It was hard to read poetry and literature. And in a way, I feel like everyone's depths were taken away and we lived in the shallows for 4 years. And, I'm going to keep doing my feminist and climate work in the Biden era, but I do feel like I'm now licensed in some ways. It's like my guard shift. I'm done with my guard shift to some extent, and I can now go do these other deeper things. And I think they're actually really important. I think this, these deeper selves and this deeper work, is also important to the well-being of the world, even when it comes to things like climate and feminism. And So that's been the other part of it. And it was just such an ugly 4 years. It felt like we'd all been dumped in, battery acid and filth or something. And we're just kind of shedding that and remembering who we might be in something that felt less like an obscene emergency.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, we will open this up. Nell, do you want to join us again and begin the questions?
Sure, I'm happy to. We have so many moving questions, and I'm certain we're not going to get through them all, but one that we can just start from the top. So Leah asks, I'm in love with your book, Wanderlust. Can you speak about how the female body in a cityscape is both liberated and in danger, and how women's tense relationship to her environment impacts women mentally and emotionally?
And in some ways, that's what we've been talking about all along. There is a way in which the city is, in English speaking culture, always seen as the place of corruption and danger. The American right loves that right now. But rural places aren't safe either. And of course, the most violence against women is committed by somebody they know. And so there is that interesting thing where we're constantly being told not to go out, but we're not really being told men are dangerous, think really hard about which ones you let into your home and your life, etc. And so there's that piece of it. But cities have been places in which women are liberated in other ways. And I live in a city where people came, and I used to say a lot, there was this period in the 90s where everybody got very sentimental about traditional close-knit, you know, communities. And I was like, I live in a city full of people who left their traditional close-knit, communities because they were trying to kill them because they were gay, lesbian, trans, misfits, etc. And there is a way that cities have been a great place to be weird. You can find your subculture, whatever sexual orientation or creative orientation, you can find great, there are universities dotted around rural places, but you can find big, New York City has people who speak 800 different languages. And if you speak a really obscure language, you can probably find people to talk to. And so I think that there's a lot of liberation there, and people have come to cities for centuries to get liberated from the control of families and churches and conventions. And the anonymity of cities can be very liberating. It's not kind of, eventually, like I am recognized now. There's, anything I do in public might end up on Twitter. And I've had weird experiences. Like I'm in a pretty long hiking trail, and the next day somebody has tweeted like, I saw Rebecca Solnit, on such and such ridge. And I'm like, well, but I think, but mostly we have that anonymity. That means, you also don't have the small community prying into like who you went out with last night and what you were wearing and whether you had more than one drink and, that kind of stuff. And but I think it's a tension between the violence of cities, and in some ways that anonymity can feel like indifference if you don't build a community. And I lived in this city before I built a community and network of people who, which is not about public life, just about personal life. So, and I think also that living in intense human diversity has been nothing but a joy. And I think so much of right-wing America is a fear of diversity that comes partly from already living in segregated, it's first of all, it's crazy white people. And second of all, who mostly live in suburbs and rural places and believe all the bullshit from the right about those other people who are queer or trans or speak other languages or emigrated recently or practice other religions or something. And, so I think it's fraught. And the Sarah Everard thing has brought up, British women are just pouring forth a public conversation about the fury and misery of never feeling completely safe your whole life to do what she did, which is walk home from a friend's house, which we should all be able to do. Although I will just add one thing to that. One of the joys of San Francisco is it was the queerest city around for a long time. And the Castro neighborhood was a place in which I always felt completely safe, partly because there were people out all night. And so it had what Jane Jacobs calls eyes on the street. And because most of the men out were gay, and it just felt like nothing bad could ever happen to me there. And there were gay bashings, there has been violence there, but it felt magic, and it still does have a kind of magic to it, as well as the banter and queer neighborhoods and straight neighborhoods that are so different than the silence of suburbia.
Indeed. And we have a question here from Rowena, which I want to preface a little bit. Oh, sorry, Chanel, did you gesture? Okay. As a Harvey Weinstein survivor, buried under a rather infamous NDA, I've struggled to tell my tale and find my own voice. I grapple with gaining ownership of my own voice and story when so many others are telling it for me. You are both public figures whom I admire greatly. How do you manage to get comfortable with your own story when so many others are commenting on it, co-opting it, speaking about it, writing about it, etc.?
Well, Chanel, you had such an interesting version of that because so much had been said about something that happened to you before you said anything publicly. And then you just kind of like started with that, one of the great documents of 21st century feminism, but anonymously, that incredible letter. And then you got to take ownership of the letter and write this book. And but it must, know my name feels like it's very much about taking back your story that other people were owning, whereas I've had a much easier experience of writing. Like, nobody was trying to tell my story until I tried to tell it, and then it was like, well, I got there first, and and I have had funny online experiences where it's like, well, I'm the expert on me, so there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because at the trial, 18 people testified. So that's 18 opinions and perspectives of the same event. And there's the argument that I couldn't even remember the event. So I was the one with almost the least amount of information. I don't know anything about him. I don't know anything about what happened. And so I was kind of positioned as the person who had nothing to offer throughout that trial. And I knew, because I was living it, that I had a whole life before this happened, and that everything that was unraveling after the assault was so potent with emotion and experience and information. And usually we tend to regard assault as this contained time frame, this little capsule, when really it's so much more about who was she before and what was disrupted, what changed, what type of life is she living now, and how are people responding to it or not responding. That's the story, right? And you are the one living it. You're the only one who possesses that perspective. No one else can write that perspective. They can always write their own truths. And I have a little disclaimer at the front of my book. I acknowledge that my truths may not align with yours, but that does not make it any less true. And there's something really wonderful about having it in a book that's been distributed globally, because even if you go to your local bookstore and burn all of them, you can go you can find another copy down the street. And so in some ways I do feel invincible now, that I don't have to be the only voice, but my voice, Rebecca uses the word counterweight. I have to be able to live having put down a counterweight to all the other opinions of my case that are out there. So even if I don't have any control over whether it's the dominant one, but at least I know that I have inserted my seat at the table permanently. And that alone is enough to give me peace. And also, congratulations on telling your story. I think you're incredible too. So I'm sending all of my love and support to you.
What Chanel said, and Ms. Chu, and thank you so much for what you have. I think I read about you in the New York Times. It sounds like a really complex situation where other people tell your story, and I know no matter how well they listen and how good their intentions, it probably never feels truly accurate to both the experience and the feelings around that. I think Chanel and I have both been lucky enough to be able to tell it ourselves unfiltered. I'm also somebody who writes about other people's lives a lot, and it's always feels like a grave responsibility. When I teach writing, I'm a complete authoritarian about you do not get to make shit up about other people. You have a duty to the historical record, the audience, and your subjects, living or dead, to not misrepresent them. Like, and if Michael Ondaatje wants to write a book about Billy the Kid, that, you know, there's plenty of stuff about him already. But if there's somebody who's not already known and the record's not already established, you have really the sacred duty, and you can, and it's, you know, and it's interesting. Usually when I write about living people, at length, they get to read it, or, you know, sometimes if it's for a magazine, the fact checkers go over it with them and stuff like that. But it is, you know, it is this grave responsibility. I have been misquoted and misrepresented, mostly in ways that have been not, you know, not terrible, just annoying. And I've yelled at people. I made the Wall Street Journal publish a correction a few years back. And, you know, but it is hard. And I know the social media world is full of people not spending enough time taking things in before they spew them out, whether it's the facts about a public thing or what somebody said. I was watching Tucker Carlson and Glenn Greenwald gang up on a New York Times reporter who said on International Women's Day that her experience of online harassment had, you know, destroyed her life. And these two men set out to mock her and then distort who she was and what she's, you know, what she said. And you just see the trolliness out there. But also, you know, the Weinstein thing, I wrote about that. I'm not about your story. And it was amazing to see something shift. So a man who got away with it all for 40 years has been in prison for a year now with a reasonably long sentence. But to look at that apparatus of silencing and to think about, in the world I want to live in a democracy of voices, there's only two imaginable narratives for Weinstein, one of which is he would have committed his first crime. The woman would have been confident about what the wrongness of what happened, about her rights, and she would have reported it to people who would have supported her completely. He would have then been, you know, punished severely enough that probably there would have been no Harvey Weinstein. But what I think is even more likely is that if he lived in a world where women were respected and had equal voice, by which I mean the space in which to speak, people and the people willing to listen, and, you know, granting us equal credibility to men when we speak up, you know, in consequence, then he would have done none of this, because it was all predicated on his being able to get away with it. And the incredible, you know, demonic network of his brother, his company, his employees, his lawyers, the Mossad spies he hired, who also harassed and followed Ronan Farrow for reporting on him. You know, he built this huge armature so he could get away with this stuff, which was about you know, the enlargement of the inequality in which these crimes took place. And it's really, you know, I keep trying to find a good way to say things are much better than they've been and they aren't nearly good enough yet. But that one case has been remarkable to see. And I'm so grateful to every woman who spoke up. And I see non-disclosure agreements as also a force of silencing. And I'm trying to, you know, I'd like to see a world in which suddenly they were just all voided. You keep the money and you tell the story.
Thank you so much. I think we'd better leave it there. Thank you to both of you for this beautiful conversation. Thanks to all of you for joining us here tonight. I posted a link in the chat one more time to, if you want to learn more and purchase this beautiful book. Again, Recollections of My Nonexistence. You can find it at harvard.com on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge. And from me and all of us, thank you so much. Have a good evening and stay safe. Thank you. Thanks again to both of you. This was
Thank
incredible.
you, Harvard. Thank you, audience. Thank you, Chanel. Thank you, feminism. And I'm seeing so many wonderful questions. I wish we had time to answer them all, but you know,
Thank you,
time runs out.
Rebecca.
Thank you, Chanel. Come visit.
I will.
We'll be vaccinated one of these days. The Bay Area loves you. At least all the good parts do. And you're all over this town. You're going to be on the side of buses, I'll take pictures.
That's why I said yes. Okay. Good night, everybody. Stay safe. And it was wonderful to spend Friday night together.
Thank you.
Take care.